Welcome to Professor Explains. Tonight, settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the weight of the day pool somewhere beneath you, somewhere you no longer have to carry it. We are going somewhere very old and very far away, and there is no hurry at all in getting there. You can close your eyes whenever you like. The story will go on without you needing to follow every turn, and it will still be here, waiting in the dark. Picture then a body of water, not a pond, not a lake as you might know it from a quiet weekend, a place you could walk around in an afternoon. Picture an inland sea. Picture an expanse of fresh, open water so wide that standing on one shore, you could not see the other. The far bank would be hidden by the curve of the world itself, swallowed beneath the horizon the way the ocean swallows a ship. Around 350,000 square kilometers of water. Think of that number slowly, because numbers that large stop meaning anything if we rush them. 350,000 square kilometers. That is roughly the size of the Caspian Sea, the largest enclosed body of water on Earth today, which covers around 371,000 square kilometers. The two are very nearly the same. A lake that could sit beside the Caspian and not look out of place. A lake the size of a sea. And here is the strange thing, the thing that should keep you company as you drift off. That enormous lake is gone. Where all that water once lay, glittering under the African sun, where waves once lapped against beaches and crocodiles slid from the banks and fish moved in the green shallows, there is now sand, nothing but sand for hundreds upon hundreds of kilometers, the heart of the Sahara Desert, one of the driest places that exists anywhere on the surface of this planet. We call that vanished water lake Mega Chad, mega for its size. Chad because a small remnant of it still survives. Down at the southern edge of where that great lake used to spread, there is a body of water still called Lake Chad, sitting at the meeting place of 4 countries. But it is a ghost of what came before. Today, depending on the season and the year and how much rain has fallen, modern Lake Chad covers perhaps somewhere between 1,500 and 25,000 square kilometers, sometimes less. A shrunken, shallow, struggling thing, a puddle compared to its ancestor. From an inland sea the size of the Caspian down to a fraction so small you could lose it inside the old shoreline and never find it again. So imagine that. Imagine standing on what is now bone-dry desert, somewhere far north of the modern lake, somewhere with no water for 100 kilometers in any direction, only dunes and heat and the great silence of the Sahara. And imagine that beneath your feet, beneath that sand, there are old beaches, beach ridges, the long, low, curving lines of sediment that water leaves behind when it laps against a shore for thousands of years. There are deposits of something called diatomite, which is the chalky, pale, packed remains of countless microscopic algae called diatoms, the kind of life that only blooms in open, standing water. There are the fossil bones of fish and the shells of freshwater mollusks lying in the sand where no fish could survive for a single hour today. The shore of a sea written into a desert, the fingerprint of an ocean in a place where it has not rained meaningfully in a very long time. How is that possible? How can the largest hot desert on Earth have once held a lake the size of a sea? That question is the doorway we are going to step through tonight, very slowly, and on the other side of it is one of the most beautiful and most calming ideas in all of Earth's deep history. So let me tell it to you plainly, here at the start, and then we will spend the rest of our long, quiet hours unfolding it, gently, like a map being smoothed open on a table by candlelight. Here is the idea. The Sahara is not permanently a desert. The Sahara is not a fixed thing, not a place that has always been sand and always will be. The Sahara breathes, it inhales green and it exhales sand And it does this over and over and over again on a rhythm so slow that no human life could ever notice it, but a rhythm that is as regular and as reliable as a tide. Roughly every 20,000 years or so, give or take, the Sahara turns green. Grasslands spread across the dunes, lakes fill, rivers run, animals come, people come. And then, after some thousands of years, the green retreats, the lakes dry, the rivers vanish into the sand, and the desert returns. And then, 20,000 years later or thereabouts, it all happens again. We have a name for each of these green chapters. We call them African humid periods. It is a plain scientific name for an almost unbelievable thing, a name that hides the wonder of it the way a quiet word can hide a great feeling. An African humid period is a stretch of time, lasting thousands of years, when the Sahara is not a desert at all, but a living, watered landscape. And the most recent of these green chapters, the most recent African humid period, was not so very long ago in the great scale of the Earth. It ran from roughly 11,000 years ago to roughly 5,000 years ago. That is the one that filled Lake Megachad. That is the one whose dried beaches lie under the sand. That is the one we will spend so much of tonight inside, because it is the one we can still see, still touch, still read in the rock and the bone and the painted walls of caves. 11,000 to 5,000 years ago. Let that sit. Human beings, people very much like us, with families and fears and the same need for sleep that you have right now, were alive during that green Sahara. They walked beside that great lake. They fished in it. They painted what they saw. And the desert that we think of as eternal, the desert that fills the picture in our minds, the moment someone says the word Sahara, the endless sea of sand, the symbol of all that is dry and dead and empty, that desert in its current form is younger than some of the things human beings have built. The Sahara, as we know it, is not ancient. It is, in a sense, only recently dried. Before we go any further into how this happens, I want to do one small thing, and then I will let you sink back down into the story. If you are awake enough to read a comment or to leave one, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. There is something fitting about it, given where we are going. We are about to talk about a planet that breathes a single Earth, turning slowly under a single sun, and you are out there somewhere on that turning surface, in your own dark, in your own quiet room, perhaps under a different sky than mine. So tell me where you are. I read them. And if you are new here and you would like more of these slow, quiet journeys to fall asleep inside, you are very welcome to subscribe. That is all. No more interruptions. Let yourself drift now. We have a long, soft night ahead of us, and the rest of it is only the story. So, how does a desert breathe? How does the Sahara turn green and then dry and then green again on a clock that ticks once every 20,000 years? The answer, and this is the part I find most beautiful, the part that I hope you carry down into sleep with you, is that the answer is not on Earth at all. The clock is in the sky. It is written in the slow motion of the planet itself, in the way the Earth tilts and turns and wobbles as it travels around the sun. The Sahara greens and dries because of the shape of the Earth's path through space and the slow swaying of its axis, and nothing that happens here below could ever change that rhythm or hurry it along. The desert keeps time with the heavens. Let me explain it the way I would explain it to someone falling asleep, which is to say, slowly, and with no need to hold every piece in your mind at once. You know that the Earth spins, and that this spinning is what gives us day and night. You know that the Earth travels in a great loop around the sun, and that this journey, lasting 1 year, is what gives us the seasons, Because the Earth is tilted. Its axis, the imaginary line from the North Pole to the South Pole around which it spins, is not standing straight up. It leans. It leans by about 23 degrees, and because it leans, as the Earth journeys around the Sun, sometimes the northern half of the planet is tipped toward the Sun, leaning into the light, and that is our summer in the north. And half a year later, the northern half is tipped away, leaning into the dark, and that is winter. The tilt is the reason the seasons exist at all. Without it, every day would be much the same, everywhere, all year. Now hold that picture of a spinning, tilted, traveling Earth. And here is where the magic comes in, the slow magic that drives our whole story. That tilted axis does not point in the same direction forever. It moves very, very slowly. The axis itself swings around in a great circle, like the slow, wide circling of a spinning top as it begins to tire. You have seen a child's top do this, or a coin spun on a table. As it spins, the top does not stay perfectly upright. Its axis leans, and then that lean itself begins to swing around in a lazy circle, tracing a cone in the air, round and round, while the top keeps spinning. The Earth does exactly the same thing. The whole planet is an enormous, slow top, and the direction its axis points wanders in a great circle across the heavens. We have a word for this slow circling of the axis. We call it precession. Axial precession. And the reason it matters so much, the reason it is the secret engine of the green Sahara, is the time it takes. One full circle of this wobble, one complete swing of the Earth's axis around its cone, takes somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 years. There it is. There is your 20,000-year clock. The Sahara greens and dries on a rhythm of roughly 20,000 years, because that is how long the Earth takes to complete one slow wobble of its axis. The desert is keeping time with the turning of the sky. But why should a wobble of the axis change a desert? You might wonder that half asleep, and it is a good thing to wonder. The wobble does not change how much the Earth leans. The tilt stays about the same, around 23 degrees. What the wobble changes is the timing. It changes which season happens at which point in the Earth's loop around the Sun. And that, it turns out, makes all the difference in the world. Here is the thing about that loop, that yearly journey around the Sun. It is not a perfect circle. It is very slightly stretched, very slightly oval, what we call an ellipse. And because the loop is slightly stretched, there is one point in the year when the Earth comes closest to the Sun, nearer than at any other time, and one point when it is farthest away. The closest point has a name. We call it perihelion. Peri meaning near, helion from the Sun, the point of nearest approach. When the Earth reaches perihelion, it is bathed in a little more of the Sun's light and warmth, simply because it is closer. Now bring those two slow motions together and watch what happens. We have the wobble, the precession, slowly changing which season lines up with which part of the orbit. And we have perihelion, the moment of closest approach, where the sunlight is a little stronger. Today, as it happens, the Earth reaches perihelion in the depths of the northern winter, in early January. The northern half of the planet is closest to the Sun precisely when it is leaning away into the cold and dark. The extra sunlight of perihelion falls, in a sense, on the wrong season for the North. It is wasted on a hemisphere turned away. But because of precession, because of that slow 20,000-year wobble, this arrangement does not last. Over thousands of years, the timing slides. The moment of perihelion drifts around the calendar, slowly, until eventually It no longer falls in northern winter but in northern summer. And when that happens, when perihelion lines up with the northern summer, everything changes for North Africa. Because then the Earth's closest approach to the sun, its moment of strongest sunlight, falls exactly when the northern half of the planet is already tipped toward the sun and basking in its season of light. The two effects stack. The strongest sunlight arrives in the brightest season, and the summer sun over the northern lands, over North Africa, over the Sahara, grows fierce in a way it simply is not today. How much fiercer? The scientists who study this, working from the careful mathematics of the Earth's orbit, the kind of patient calculation worked out by researchers like Berger and Loutre, who mapped these orbital rhythms across the ages, tell us that during the last green Sahara, the peak summer sunlight falling on the northern part of the world was something like 7 to 8% stronger than it is today. 7 or 8% more energy, more warmth, arriving each summer, pouring down onto the land of North Africa. That does not sound like much, perhaps, 7 or 8% when you say it quickly. But across the whole surface of a continent, summer after summer, century after century, it is an immense addition of heat and energy. And that additional summer heat is the key that unlocks everything, because of what it does to the rain. To understand the rain, we need one more gentle idea, and then the picture will be complete, and you can let it all wash over you like warm water. The idea is this. Rain, in the great heat of the tropics, follows the sun, the wettest places on Earth, the deep tropical bands where storms build every afternoon and rain falls in warm sheets, sit roughly where the sun is most directly overhead, where its heat is strongest. The strong sun heats the ground, the heated ground warms the air, the warm air rises, and as it rises it cools, and the moisture in it gathers into clouds and falls as rain. There is a great belt of this rising air and heavy rain that wraps around the middle of the Earth, and it has a name, a rather technical name, that I will give you once and then mostly set aside. We call it the Intertropical Convergence Zone, the place where the winds of the north and the winds of the south converge in the tropics, and air rises and rain falls. The Intertropical Convergence Zone. The rain belt of the world. That rain belt is not nailed in place. It moves with the seasons, sliding north when the northern summer pulls the strongest heat northward, sliding south again when the south has its turn. And in West Africa, this seasonal march of the rain belt has its own name. We call it the West African Monsoon. The monsoon is simply the great seasonal arrival of the rains, dragged north each year by the summer heat, watering the lands of the Sahel, the green ribbon of grassland that runs along the southern edge of the Sahara. Today, the West African monsoon pushes north each summer, brings its rains to the Sahel, and then stops. It stops far south of the deep desert. The deep Sahara waits and waits, and the rains never reach it, year after year after year, and so it stays sand. But now, gently, put the pieces together. Take the slow wobble, the precession, sliding perihelion into the northern summer. Take the 7 or 8% stronger summer sun pouring down on North Africa. What does that extra summer heat do? It heats the northern land more fiercely than ever. And that fiercer heat reaches out and grabs the rain belt, the monsoon, and pulls it further north than it can reach today. Much further. The extra summer warmth drags the West African monsoon and its rains hundreds of kilometers northward, up and up, past the Sahel, up into lands that are now hopeless desert, up toward a latitude of around 23 degrees north, deep into the heart of what is now pure sand. The rain belt, the great band of rising air and falling water, simply walks north, pulled by the strengthened summer sun, and it walks right into the Sahara. This is the heart of the matter. This is the whole secret told as simply as I know how to tell it. The understanding that the strengthened summer sun would haul the monsoon north and water the desert is something that careful scientists worked out by modeling the way sunlight and air and rain respond to these orbital changes, work pioneered by a researcher named Kutzbach, who showed how the changing summer sunlight of these orbital rhythms could drive the monsoon decades ago now. And the picture they built is this. The wobble of the axis swings perihelion into northern summer. The summer sun over North Africa grows 7 or 8% stronger. The strengthened sun drags the rain belt, the West African monsoon, hundreds of kilometers north, deep into the desert, up to around 23 degrees north. And the rain begins to fall on the Sahara. Not for a season, not for a year, for thousands of years. And the Sahara turns green. The dunes do not vanish overnight, of course. Nothing in this story is sudden, except perhaps the ending, but that is for another night. The green comes slowly, the way everything in deep time comes slowly. The first rains soak into the thirsty sand. Grasses take root. Where there are hollows in the land, water gathers and does not fully dry, and small lakes appear, and then larger ones, and then, in the great basins, in the lowest hearts of the land, the water gathers and gathers until it becomes that inland sea, that Lake Mega-Chad, 350,000 square kilometers of fresh water as large as the Caspian, filling the center of a continent. The rivers run. The grasslands spread out across the dunes and bind them down and turn the gold of the sand to the green of growing things. And the animals follow the green, and the people follow the animals, and a whole living world settles itself across the face of what had been only a few thousand years before a wasteland of sand. And here is the thought to fall asleep on, the first of many tonight. None of this was a miracle, and none of it was an accident, and none of it was a single, never-to-be-repeated event. It was the turning of a wheel. It was the earth doing exactly what the earth always does, leaning and wobbling and circling the sun, and the desert responding exactly as it always responds, filling with green when the rains come north and emptying back into sand when they retreat. It had happened before. It would happen again. The most recent green Sahara, the one from 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, the one whose old beaches lie under the sand and whose painted caves still wait in the cliffs, was simply the latest turning of a wheel that has been turning for a very, very long time. One breath in a long, slow series of breaths, stretching back through the ages. There is something deeply restful in that, I think, if you let it settle. We are so used to thinking of the desert as the very picture of permanence. The Sahara stands in our minds for everything that does not change, the endless dunes, the merciless and eternal sand. But that is a trick of the short span of a human life. We live, at most, for a handful of decades. The wheel turns once every 20,000 years. We are like a single grain of that sand watching the dune and swearing it has stood forever, when in truth it is only passing through one slow phase of emotion far too large for us to feel. The desert outside, wherever the nearest desert to you may be, is not eternal. It is a chapter. The green will come again. It is only a matter of when. But I am getting ahead of the story, and there is no need to rush toward the ending, especially not tonight. Before we ever reach the question of when the green returns, there is the green that has already been, the green we can still see. And, oh, what a thing it was to see, because we are not only guessing at this lost world from beach ridges and fossil shells and the mathematics of the sky. We have something far more intimate than that. We have pictures. We have the painted and carved walls of the Green Sahara made by the hands of the people who lived there, who looked out at a watered land full of giraffes and elephants and herds of cattle, and pressed those very sites into the stone where they have waited in the dry dark for thousands of years for us to come and find them. We have the faces of a lost world, drawn by the ones who saw it with their own eyes. So let us go there, slowly. Let us leave the great calculations of orbit and sunlight behind for now, and go down into the cliffs and the caves of the central Sahara, to the painted plateaus where the green world wrote itself onto the rock. There is a place in southern Algeria, high in the mountains, a plateau of strange, wind-carved sandstone towers where the people of the Green Sahara left thousands upon thousands of images. There are places in Libya, in Chad, in Egypt, hidden in the most remote and waterless corners of the modern desert, where the walls are covered in the memory of water. And there is one painting in particular, in one cave, in one of the driest places on the entire face of the earth, that shows something so unexpected, so quietly astonishing, that when it was first found, it must have seemed almost impossible. It shows people swimming, figures with their arms and legs spread, floating, moving through water, painted onto a rock wall in a place where today there is not one single drop. We will go to that cave. We will stand before those swimmers, but not yet, not quite yet. For now, simply hold the picture in your mind as you drift. A green Sahara, an inland sea the size of the Caspian, glittering in the heart of the continent, grasslands rolling over the buried dunes, rivers finding their way down to the Great Lake, and somewhere on its shore, beneath a sky tipped a little closer to the summer sun, people moving through their day, watching the water, lifting their hands, ready to set down everything they saw onto the patient stone. Let us begin then with the lake itself, because once you have truly seen it, you cannot unsee it, and the whole shape of the story changes around it. Lake Megachad. The name sounds almost like an exaggeration, like something invented for the telling, but it is not. At its fullest, during the last Great Green Phase, it spread across something on the order of 350,000 square kilometers. Stop for a moment and let that number settle, slowly, the way water settles into a low place. 350,000 square kilometers of open fresh water, sitting in the middle of what is now the largest hot desert on the planet. That is not a lake in the ordinary sense, not the kind you might picture from the edge of a shore. That is an inland sea. It rivaled the Caspian, which today covers around 371,000 square kilometers and is, by most reckonings, the largest enclosed body of water on Earth. The Sahara held something nearly its equal, and held it not once, but again and again, filling and draining on a rhythm older than any civilization. And where is it now? Where is all that water? The answer is the strangest part, and the most quietly humbling. The descendant of Megachad still exists. It is called simply Lake Chad, and it is one of the saddest small remnants you could imagine. A shrunken pond by comparison, slipping at times below a few thousand square kilometers, rising and falling with the seasons and the years. A thin glimmer where once an inland sea stretched to the horizon in every direction. The map you know is the map of the Axial. The lake you have seen in photographs is the leftover. The sand stretches now over what was once shoreline, over beaches and reed beds and the homes of fish, and if you walked out into that sand today, you would find, scattered across it, the proof. Fossil fish. The shells of freshwater mollusks, beach ridges, the old wave-built lines of a vanished coast, stranded hundreds of kilometers from any living water. Diatomite, the pale, chalky sediment made from the fossil skeletons of microscopic algae that can only live in open water. It is all there, written into the ground, the unmistakable handwriting of a sea that the desert swallowed. Now here is the reframe, the thing that turns this from a curiosity into a kind of revelation. Most of what you have heard about the Green Sahara treats it as a single event, a lost paradise, a one-time golden age that flourished and then was gone forever, like Atlantis sinking beneath the waves. It is a beautiful story, and it is wrong, or at least it is far too small, because the Sahara does not green once. The Sahara breathes. It inhales green and exhales sand, and it does this on a steady, patient, repeating rhythm, roughly every 20,000 years, going back not just tens of thousands of years, but hundreds of thousands, deep into the past, far beyond the reach of any human memory. Each of these green episodes has a proper name, a name the scientists use. They call it an African humid period. The most recent one ran, very roughly, from around 11,000 years ago to around 5,000 years ago. That is the one that filled Mega-Chad. That is the one the painted swimmers lived inside. But before it there was another, and another before that, and the desert outside your window tonight is not a permanent fact of the world. It is one phase of a long, slow breath. If you are lying there in the dark, somewhere on this turning planet, I would genuinely like to know where you are listening from tonight. What country, what city, what quiet room. The comments are there, and I read them. And if these slow journeys into the deep past help you find your way down towards sleep, you are welcome to stay a while. There are more of them here, waiting, of the same unhurried kind. So now we come to the heart of it, the question beneath all the others. Why? Why would a desert breathe at all? What could possibly fill an inland sea and then drain it, over and over, on a rhythm 20,000 years long? The answer is not on the ground. It is not in the rivers or the rains or anything you could point to from the shore of the lake. The answer is in the sky. It is in the slow geometry of the Earth itself, turning through space. The Earth, as it spins, does not hold its axis perfectly still. It wobbles very slowly, the way a spinning top wobbles as it begins to tire, tracing a great slow circle in the heavens over a span of roughly 21 to 23,000 years. This wobble has a name. It is called axial precession. And what it does over those tens of thousands of years is change the timing of the seasons against the shape of the Earth's orbit. There is a point each year when the Earth swings closest to the Sun. That point is called perihelion. And there are long stretches of the cycle when perihelion falls right in the middle of the northern summer, so that the northern half of the world, North Africa among it, leans toward the Sun at the very moment it is already nearest. When that alignment comes, the summer sunlight falling on North Africa grows stronger by something on the order of 7 or 8% more than it receives today. And that extra warmth, that intensified summer, reaches down and takes hold of the great rain machine of the continent. It strengthens the West African monsoon, and it drags the tropical rain belt, the band the scientists call the intertropical convergence zone, far north of where it sits now, hundreds of kilometers north, pushing the rains up toward 23 degrees of latitude, deep into ground that today knows no rain at all. And so the question shifts. If the sky was delivering all that rain, if the monsoon had walked north hundreds of kilometers, and the Great Lake in the heart of the continent had swollen to a size that rivaled the Caspian Sea, then what did the land actually look like? What was there on the ground inside all that moisture? Because there is a story that gets told sometimes in the popular imagination that goes something like this. The Sahara was once a jungle, a paradise, a green Eden of tangled forest and flowers, a lost world of tropical abundance that some catastrophe erased. And it is a story that is wrong in almost every important detail, and yet it is so persistent, so appealing, that it is worth pausing here, in the quiet of this long, slow descent, to correct it gently, because the truth is stranger and more beautiful and far more interesting than the myth. The Green Sahara was not a jungle, it was not a rainforest, it was not some dense canopy of equatorial vegetation that has been erased without a trace. What the evidence shows when you piece it together from pollen grains preserved in lake sediments, and from the wax of ancient leaves still locked in the mud, and from the bones and shells found lying in places where no animal could survive today, is something more like a vast savanna, a mosaic. Grasslands rolling out in every direction, cut through by rivers and streams that do not exist now, opening here and there into wetlands, into seasonal floodplains, into the shallows of enormous, shallow lakes. Trees, certainly, scattered across that grassland the way they are in the modern Sahel, not packed into an impenetrable wall of forest, but standing apart, giving shade, rooted along the watercourses. Acacia and dome palm. The sort of landscape you might still find today in parts of Chad or Mali or northern Cameroon, in the wetter years just pushed 500 or 600 or 700 kilometers north, well into what is now the heart of the desert. A grassland and wetland mosaic, not a paradise of cascading vines and orchids, but something equally astonishing in its own right, a vast and living and inhabited world sitting exactly where the emptiest desert on Earth now lies. It supported life on a scale that is almost impossible to hold in the mind. Giraffes moved through that northern grassland, elephants found water, hippopotamuses, enormous and slow, lay in the rivers and the lake shores. Crocodiles slid through water that is now dry sand. The bones of these animals have been found out in the desert, not as isolated curiosities, but in numbers, spread across sites that were once rivers and lakes and wetlands. Freshwater shellfish, the fossils of fish, the skeletal remains of creatures that require permanent open water to survive, turning up in places where the nearest moisture is hundreds of kilometers away. The Green Sahara was not empty, and it was not a myth, and the evidence for it is not subtle. It is lying out on the sand. But there is another kind of evidence, one that is not buried, not hidden in lake sediments or sealed in sedimentary rock, one that is right there, on the surface, on the walls of the stone itself, if you know where to look. And it is, in a way, the most haunting evidence of all, because it was put there by human hands. The rock art of the Central Sahara is one of the great collections of ancient human imagery on Earth, and it is spread across an enormous area, reaching from the plateau systems of Algeria into Libya, and across into Chad and Niger, and down through Egypt. The people who made it were not doing something unusual or ceremonial or rare. They were doing what people do, recording the world around them, painting and carving what they saw, what they hunted, what they herded, what mattered to them. And what they saw in the world around them was nothing that the Sahara today would suggest was possible. In southwestern Algeria, rising steeply from the desert floor, is a high plateau of sandstone that the Tuareg people call Tassili Niger, a name that carries within it the sense of a plateau of rivers. It is one of the most remote and inhospitable places in the world today. The summer temperatures can push past 50 degrees Celsius. There is almost no water. The landscape is a labyrinth of eroded sandstone columns and narrow passages, a place of extraordinary geological beauty that is also, in the bluntest terms, barely survivable. And on the walls of that labyrinthine stone, sheltered from the wind in shallow overhangs and deep rock corridors, there are more than 15,000 individual engravings and paintings. 15,000 at minimum. The precise count is uncertain because the plateau is vast and not every surface has been methodically surveyed, but 15,000 is the scale we are working with. Many of them are thousands of years old. Some may be older still, and they show with astonishing clarity a world that could not exist in that place today. There are giraffes, painted or engraved in profile, tall and unmistakable, walking through a landscape that is implied but not shown. There are rhinoceros, there are elephants, there are hippopotamus, bulky and wide, animals that cannot survive without deep and permanent water painted onto rock that is now in one of the driest regions of Africa. There are crocodiles, there are cattle. Not wild cattle, but herded cattle, shown with the rounded horns and the heavy-shouldered posture of domesticated animals, attended by human figures. There are people engaged in what appears to be everyday life. There are scenes that look like dancing. There are figures running, resting, tending animals. And the sequence of the paintings and engravings, pieced together through careful stylistic and archaeological work, tells a story across time, a story of a world that was changing even as the people living in it were watching. The earliest and most ancient phase of the rock art is dominated by images of large wild animals, bucrania, long-horned bovids, creatures that belong to an older landscape. This is the phase that researchers call the wild fauna or bubaline period, named for the bubalus, a large prehistoric buffalo whose remains have been found across North Africa. These are images made by hunters. The creatures shown are prey. The world they imply is one where the grassland was rich enough to support enormous wild animals in numbers. Then as you move forward in time, something shifts. The art begins to show a different kind of human figure, rounder in style, stranger, and more complex in execution, with elaborate headdresses and almost dreamlike compositions. This is the round head period, named for the rounded, often featureless heads of the human figures depicted. The meaning of these images is debated. They may reflect something ceremonial or cosmological, or simply a stylistic shift in how people chose to represent themselves. But they appear overlapping in time with the earlier wild fauna images, suggesting a transition, a period when the old world and whatever was coming next coexisted. And then comes the third phase, the one that, in terms of sheer narrative weight, is perhaps the most striking, because what it shows is not hunters moving through wild grassland. What it shows is herders, people with cattle, domesticated cattle, in large numbers, attended by human figures with all the body language and spatial arrangement of pastoral life. Cows and calves, bulls with distinctive markings, milking scenes possibly, people and animals clearly in a relationship of long familiarity. This is the pastoral or Bovidian period, and it tells you that at a certain point during the African humid period, the green Sahara was not just a landscape that people occasionally passed through, it was a place people lived, a place where families kept cattle and moved with the rains and established a way of life that must have felt, to those living it, entirely and perfectly sustainable. And then the paintings stop, not all at once and not abruptly in the record, but the pastoral tradition comes to an end. The art thins, the cattle disappear from the walls, and the human presence in these places begins to contract and recede, following the rains south as the rains themselves slowly, or in some places not so slowly, began to withdraw. But before we reach that ending, there is one image, one specific place, that deserves to be held and considered for a moment longer, because it is, of all the evidence in the green Sahara's long record, perhaps the strangest, perhaps the most quietly astonishing. In the southwestern corner of Egypt, in the deeply remote plateau region called the Gilf Kebir, there is a cave. It is not large. It is a shallow rock overhang, really, a shelter in the stone rather than a true underground chamber. But on its walls there are painted figures, ancient human forms, and they are doing something that seems, given where this place is, entirely impossible. They appear to be swimming. The figures are horizontal, their arms are extended forward or raised above their bodies, their legs are behind them. The posture, the arrangement of the limbs, the implied movement, has led almost everyone who has looked at these paintings to the same conclusion. These people are swimming. They are in water. They are moving through it with their arms and their bodies in a way that is specific and unmistakable. And this cave, This rock overhang with its swimmers on the walls sits in one of the most arid places on the surface of the Earth. The Gilf Kebir Plateau receives on average something approaching zero rainfall. There are years when no measurable rain falls there at all. The ground for hundreds of kilometers in every direction is gravel and stone and wind-scoured sand. There is no water. There has not been any water in any meaningful sense for thousands of years. The cave was found by Laszlo Almasi, a Hungarian explorer and desert navigator, in 1933. Almasi had been moving through the Libyan desert, mapping and surveying in the years when that remote interior was only beginning to be recorded by European eyes. He came to the Gilf Kebir Plateau and, in one of its rock corridors, found the paintings. The Cave of Swimmers, as it came to be called, entered the record of exploration, and it sat there, quietly remarkable, for decades, known mainly to specialists and desert travelers, until a novel and then a film turned it into something more widely recognized. But the recognition, the fame, changed nothing about what the cave actually is, a document left by human hands of a world that is gone. A world where the people who sheltered in that overhang needed to know how to swim. Where there was water enough, close enough, that swimming was part of ordinary life. Where a child might have grown up in that landscape the way a child grows up near a river or a lake, taking the water for granted, not thinking about how extraordinary it was. How long ago? The paintings themselves are difficult to date precisely because the pigments used, ochres and iron oxides mixed with water or animal fat, do not always lend themselves to direct radiocarbon dating without damaging the images. What can be said is that their style and context are consistent with the wider rock art tradition of the Central Sahara during the African humid period. They were made when the water was there. They were made by people for whom swimming was a normal enough activity to record. And they have survived in that dry air, in that shelter of stone, for thousands of years, waiting for a desert explorer on a camel to come around a corner and find them. There is something in that image, in the thought of those painted swimmers preserved in one of the world's driest places, that is worth staying with. Not as a mystery to solve, but as a fact to feel. Somewhere in the southwestern desert of Egypt, in a cave that has not seen rain in living memory, there are human figures frozen in the act of swimming, painted by people who were alive in a green world that no longer exists. They were not trying to leave a record for the future. They were not thinking about the 10,000 years that would pass, or the desert that would fill in behind them, or the explorer who would come. They were just painting their world. And their world had water in it. Now, if the Cave of Swimmers is a glimpse of the lived daily experience of the Green Sahara, a kind of intimate domestic detail, a flash of someone's afternoon on a riverbank or a lakeshore, then there is another kind of evidence that gives you the geography of the whole landscape, the physical scale of the water that filled it. And that evidence is what the geologists call megachad. To understand what Lake Megachad was, you need to start with what Lake Chad is now. Today, Lake Chad occupies a flat, shallow depression in the center-south of the Sahara, right at the corner where Chad, Niger, Cameroon, and Nigeria meet. It is one of Africa's larger lakes by area, though its area varies enormously by season and year, contracting and expanding with the rains, sometimes measuring as small as 1,500 square kilometers in dry years, sometimes reaching 25,000 or more after good monsoons. It is a lake under stress. Over the last several decades, it has shrunk dramatically, retreating from its margins, exposing lakebed that was recently underwater. The pressures on it are real and well documented, and the lake's decline in modern times is one of the more visible environmental changes in Africa. But in the deep past, during the African humid period, when the monsoon had walked north and the rains were falling far beyond where they fall today, what occupied that same depression was not a modest seasonal lake in the scrub. it was something of an entirely different order. Lake Megachad, the enormous ancestor of the modern lake, covered an area of roughly 350,000 square kilometers. Some reconstructions put it as high as 400,000, 350,000 square kilometers. To hold that number in your mind, you need a comparison. The Caspian Sea, the largest enclosed body of water on Earth today, has a surface area of roughly 371,000 square kilometers. Lake Megachad, sitting in what is now the heart of the Sahara, was comparable to the Caspian Sea, perhaps a little smaller, perhaps at its peak approaching the same size. An inland sea, essentially, filling the center of the continent, fed by monsoon rains falling over an area of grassland and savanna that stretched hundreds of kilometers in every direction. It was shallow, much shallower than the Caspian, which has great depth in its southern basin. Megachad sat in a relatively flat depression and spread very wide rather than down. But shallow does not mean small, and shallow does not mean lifeless. A vast shallow lake in a warm climate fed by rivers carrying sediment and nutrients from the surrounding savanna is a lake of extraordinary biological richness. Fish in numbers difficult to imagine, waterfowl in millions, the shores lined with the animals of a wetland ecosystem, hippos and crocodiles, and the birds that follow them, the whole churning, productive machinery of a great African wetland stretched across an area of water the size of a small sea. The evidence for this is not speculative. It is sitting on the surface of the desert, and it is visible from space. Because when Megachad shrank, as the rains retreated and the insolation shifted and the monsoon pulled back south, it did not leave nothing behind. It left its shorelines. The high watermarks of a lake that vast do not vanish. They are recorded in the landscape as beach ridges, raised bands of sand and gravel that mark where the waves once lapped. They are recorded in the sediments as diatomite, thick, pale layers of the fossil shells of diatoms, tiny silica-shelled algae that bloom in lake water and fall to the bottom when they die, building up over centuries into coherent layers that geologists can core and date and read like a calendar. And they are recorded in something even more compelling than sediment, in the remains of the creatures that lived there. Fossil fish have been found hundreds of kilometers from the modern lakeshore, not single specimens, not isolated curiosities, but material from species that require permanent open freshwater to survive. The bones of fish that would have grown large in a rich and productive lake, lying out on the gravel and the sand of a desert that has not seen water in 4,000 years. Freshwater mollusks, the shells of snails and bivalves that cannot tolerate salt or drought, scattered across the landscape of what is now the southern Sahara, their calcite shells still recognizable, still telling the story of the water that once surrounded them. The work of mapping this evidence was done in systematic form by researchers including Nick Drake and Charlie Bristow, whose 2006 paper in the Holocene brought together the paleo shoreline data and the sediment records and the fossil assemblages to lay out the full extent of what the lake had been. And what it had been, the numbers and the mapped extents make clear, was one of the largest lakes that has existed on the surface of this planet in the time that human beings have been alive to see it. There is something else that Megachad's former presence tells you, something that goes beyond the lake itself. A lake of that size, 350,000 square kilometers of open water, is not just a lake, it is a weather system. It is a source of evaporation that feeds clouds that feed rain. A lake the size of an inland sea changes the local and regional climate around it, drawing moisture in, cycling water back into the atmosphere, sustaining the surrounding grassland in ways that a smaller water body could not. Megachad was not simply a product of the African humid period, it was, in part, a sustainer of it, a feedback loop within the larger orbital and monsoon system, amplifying and prolonging the conditions that had created it. The lake and the grassland and the rains were all part of the same self-sustaining system, each element reinforcing the others, and the rivers that fed it were real rivers. Not seasonal wadis that run for a few hours after a storm and then go dry. Rivers with names now given to the channels they left behind, the buried courses that in some cases are still detectable in the landscape. Radar imagery from space, specifically the synthetic aperture radar systems carried by the space shuttle and later by satellite platforms, can penetrate the thin, dry sand of the Sahara and reveal what lies beneath it. And what lies beneath it, in places, is the imprint of ancient channels. River valleys cut into the bedrock or the sediment beneath the sand, their courses wandering and braiding and converging the way rivers do, marked in the radar, return by the difference in texture between the loose sand above and the compacted or coarser material in the old riverbed below. The green Sahara had rivers. The channels are still there, under the sand. The plumbing of the wet world is buried, but intact. Some of these ancient river systems were vast. The drainage basins that fed Megachad were enormous, pulling water off a huge area of what is now desert, channeling it down toward the Great Central Depression, and other paleo river systems drained westward and northward toward the Atlantic and the Mediterranean through routes that are now bone dry. The researchers Kristina Skonieczny and colleagues published work in 2015 in Nature Communications showing evidence of a buried river system feeding into a submarine canyon on the Atlantic floor off the coast of Mauritania, a canyon called the Cap Timiris Canyon, with sediment characteristics suggesting it had received major river input during the humid period. The ghost of a river that once carried Saharan water to the sea, now buried under desert sand, its mouth preserved only on the ocean floor. All of this, the vast lake, the fossil fish, the beach ridges, the buried river channels, the rock art of swimmers and cattle and elephants, the beach ridges mapped by Drake and Bristow, the pollen records, the leaf wax biomarkers, all of it converges on the same picture. The green Sahara was real, it was inhabited, it was productive. It was a landscape that supported large animals and large human populations across an area that is now entirely uninhabitable. And none of it was a jungle, none of it was the tangled fantasy of a lost tropical paradise. It was a grassland, a savanna, a mosaic of wetlands and rivers and shallow lakes set in a sea of grass under a sky that brought rain because the Earth's axis was tilted in such a way that the summer sun fell harder on North Africa than it does today, pulling the monsoon north and holding it there for thousands of years. It is worth staying with the rock art a little longer because the sequence it records is, in its own way, a kind of compressed history, a slow-motion film of change encoded in paint and engraved in stone by the people who were living it. The transition from the wild fauna phase, the hunters among the big game, to the pastoral phase, the herders with their cattle, is not a sudden jump. It plays out over a long span of time, the two traditions overlapping, the world shifting gradually enough that the people in it could adapt, could change their economy, could move from hunting wild animals to herding domesticated ones as the landscape matured and the populations grew. There is a logic to it. A wetter and richer landscape with more stable water sources favors a pastoral economy. You can stay in one place longer. You can maintain a herd. You can think across seasons and years rather than just days and weeks, and the cattle themselves are not a small detail. Cattle require water. They require grass. They require, in a desert environment, conditions that the desert does not provide. The fact that cattle were being herded across what is now the Central Sahara tells you something very specific about what the landscape was capable of supporting. It tells you there was enough grass and enough water and enough predictable seasonal movement of both to make cattle pastoralism not just possible but viable, a way of life stable enough to sustain communities across generations, stable enough that those communities built up the artistic traditions recorded at Tassili Naja and Tadrat Akakus and the Enedi Plateau and the Gilf Kebir, stable enough that they had time to paint. The Tadrat Akakus in southwestern Libya is a mountain range of dark volcanic rock rising steeply from the sand, and its caves and shelters hold rock art traditions closely related to those of Tassili Naja across the border in Algeria. The two sites are sometimes discussed together as the core of the central Saharan rock art tradition, and together they span the same long arc from wild fauna to pastoral cattle, the same transition, the same world, seen from slightly different vantage points across a landscape that, in the humid period, would have been connected by rivers and grassland where it is now divided by dunes. To the east, in Chad, the Enedi Plateau provides yet another window into the same world. The Enedi is a sandstone massif in the northeastern corner of Chad, a landscape of arches and pillars and narrow gorges that catches the occasional modern rain, and supports a remnant flora and fauna that is a living ghost of what was once far more widely spread. There are still crocodiles in the Enedi, isolated populations living in small permanent pools in the rock, descendants of the crocodiles that swam through the rivers and wetlands of the green Sahara, stranded by the drying, adapting to smaller and smaller water sources over thousands of years, until they ended up in the handful of pools that still exist in that remote stone country. And on the walls of the Enedi gorges there is rock art, the same tradition, the same animals, the same cattle, the same transition. People recording the world around them before the world changed. And then to the northeast, in that remote corner of Egypt, the Gilf Kebir Plateau and its swimmers. Almasi found them in 1933 in a world that was only beginning to map its own blank spaces. The desert explorer moving through a landscape so empty and so harsh that the logistics of simply surviving in it occupied most of his attention, coming around a corner of stone and finding those painted figures on the wall, horizontal, arms extended, bodies in the water, swimming, in a place where the sand has been dry for thousands of years, where the wind carries nothing but dust, where the nearest rain of any consequence falls hundreds of kilometers away. To paint swimmers, you need to have seen swimming, you need to have done it, or watched others do it in a place close enough to the rock wall that the image felt natural and worth recording. Almasi's cave, the cave of swimmers, is not a piece of mythology or religious imagination, or at least there is no reason to read it that way before the simpler explanation is considered. The simpler explanation is the one the evidence everywhere else supports. There was water here, not just a trickle, not just a rare seasonal pond, but enough water, nearby enough, that people swam in it, that it was part of daily life, that someone thought it worth painting on the stone. The combination of the cave art and the geological record, the paleo shorelines and the diatomite and the fossil fish, and the buried river channels and the beach ridges, all of it pointing in the same direction, creates a picture of the green Sahara that is not a guess or a reconstruction built from thin evidence. It is a picture built from converging lines of proof from the bones of animals on the desert surface and the silica shells of microscopic algae in the lake sediments and the painted figures of human beings swimming where there is now no water. It is as well attested a past landscape as we have for a place that has changed so completely that the evidence of its former state is now a source of genuine astonishment. And it was a world of people. The animals were there, the elephants and the hippos and the crocodiles, but people were there too, in numbers, and they were not passing through, they were living there, they were building cultures there, they were burying their dead there. And of all the things the green Sahara left behind, the places where people lived and died and were laid to rest by those who loved them, those may be the most quietly devastating to contemplate, because they are the most human. There is a place in the Tenere Desert of Niger, deep in one of the most uninhabited stretches of the Central Sahara, where a paleontologist named Paul Sereno and his colleagues found something extraordinary in 2005, publishing their full account in 2008 in the journal PLOS One. The place is called Gobero. It sits on the edge of what was once, during the African humid period, the shoreline of a lake that is now nothing but sand. And in the sand, in the sediments that accumulated along that ancient shore, there are human graves, a lot of them. Gobero is a cemetery, or rather, it appears to be two cemeteries, or at least two distinct occupation periods layered one on top of the other, separated by a gap in time when the site was abandoned because the water retreated, and then reoccupied when the rains returned. The earlier occupation is attributed to a people the researchers call the Kifian, and it dates to between roughly 9,700 and 8,200 years ago. These were tall people, hunter-fishers, who worked the rich waters of the lake whose edge they lived beside. Their graves contain the remains of people who ate fish, who used harpoons, who lived beside a large and permanent body of water in what is now a place where nothing can survive. The later occupation belongs to a people called the Tenerian, and it dates to between roughly 7,200 and 4,500 years ago. The Tenerian were smaller in stature than the Kifian, and their remains and the objects buried with them show a different economy, more oriented toward pastoralism, toward herding, though they still lived near water. And among the Tenerian burials at Gobero, there is one that has become the best known, the one that crystallizes more than almost any other single piece of evidence from the Green Sahara. What it means to say that people lived there. Not just visited, lived. It is a triple burial, a woman and two children. The children are positioned face to face with the woman, their arms extended as if reaching toward her, or perhaps as if she is reaching toward them. They were buried this way, deliberately, placed in a specific posture that speaks of intention and relationship and grief. Someone arranged them like that. Someone made that choice in a moment of loss and put those three people in the ground together in an embrace that the sand preserved for 7,000 years, until the people who did it had been forgotten for so long that their language and their name and everything about them except their bones had vanished entirely. Around them in the sediments are fish hooks and harpoons and the remains of large fish, crocodile remains, the bones of animals that live in and beside water, the debris of daily life in a landscape that was green and wet and full of food. The Tenere today is among the most desolate places in Africa. It is a sand sea, a vast plain of dunes with almost no landmarks and almost no water and almost no life. The idea of a cemetery there, of people burying their dead with care and arranging their bodies with tenderness in a place that is now this empty, is almost impossible to hold in the mind. But Gobero is real. The triple burial is real. The woman and the two children are real. And they are there because the world was different, because the rains had come, because the Earth's axis had tilted in just the right way to drag the monsoon north and fill the lake and green the land, and people had come with the rains and built a life and lost each other and buried each other beside the water they depended on. And then the rain stopped. Not all at once, perhaps, and not the same way everywhere, but the records of what happened next are among the most debated and most carefully studied questions in all of climate science, because the question of how a world that lush and full and inhabited could become the Sahara we know today touches something deeply unsettling about how quickly a landscape can change, and how much of what we think of as permanent is only a temporary state in a system that does not hold still for us. The people at Gobero, the later Tenerian pastoralists who herded their cattle across the grasslands and buried their dead beside the lake, were living in the world at a time when the forces that had brought the rains were already, slowly, beginning to reverse. The orbital clock that had been so favorable, the wobble of the Earth's axis that had aimed the summer sun at North Africa and drawn the monsoon north, was turning, as it always does, in its long, slow cycle. The Northern Hemisphere summer was receiving fractionally less energy than it had at the peak of the green period, and in the beginning that difference would have been imperceptible. The rains would have come each year, more or less as expected. The lake would have filled and reseeded with the seasons. The cattle would have grazed, and the children would have played at the water's edge, and nothing in the ordinary texture of daily life would have suggested that anything was ending. That is the deeply strange thing about changes that operate on this timescale. The precession cycle turns so slowly that no single human lifetime, no single generation, and in some interpretations not even a single century, would have felt the full arc of what was happening. The people who lived through the early stages of the drying were not experiencing a crisis they could name. They were experiencing perhaps a run of drier years, a lake that did not fill quite as high one season, grass that did not green quite as reliably in a particular valley. The changes would have been gradual enough in the beginning to absorb into the ordinary flexibility of pastoral life. You move your herds. You follow the water. You adjust. But something was happening beneath the ordinary surface of daily adjustment. And what was happening involved not just the orbital forcing, the slow decline of summer insolation, but a second mechanism, a feedback within the landscape itself that could take the gradual withdrawal of that orbital energy and translate it into something far more abrupt. To understand this mechanism, imagine a landscape in two different states. In the first state, the ground is covered with vegetation, grasses, shrubs, scattered trees, the full green mosaic of the African humid period at its height. Vegetation like this absorbs a great deal of sunlight. Dark leaves, green surfaces, biological complexity. They take in the sun's energy and use it, and the soil beneath them, shaded and held by roots, retains moisture. The plants themselves release water back into the atmosphere through their leaves, a process called evapotranspiration, which means that a vegetated landscape actively generates some of its own humidity. The rain that falls on a green surface is more likely to return to the air in a form that can rain again somewhere nearby. The vegetation, in other words, helps sustain the rainfall that sustains the vegetation. It is a loop, a self-reinforcing cycle, and while the loop is running, the landscape tends to stay green even in the face of some degree of variability. Now imagine what happens when that vegetation begins to thin. A drought year kills off a patch of grass. The bare soil that is exposed reflects more sunlight back into the atmosphere than the dark vegetation did. This is the albedo effect. Lighter surfaces reflect more energy, darker ones absorb more, and bare desert sand reflects considerably more sunlight than vegetated ground. When that extra energy bounces back off the surface instead of being absorbed, the lower atmosphere above the bare patch heats differently. The air becomes drier, the conditions that favor rainfall become slightly less favorable, and if rainfall decreases, more vegetation dies, more bare soil is exposed, more sunlight is reflected, the air becomes drier still, the conditions for rainfall deteriorate further, more vegetation dies. The loop runs in reverse, and each step of the reversal makes the next step faster and more likely. This is what the climate scientist Martin Clausen and his colleagues modeled and described in 1999, working through the mathematics of what happens when you couple the vegetation to the climate in a way that allows feedback. What they found was that the system has a non-linear character. It does not simply dry at the same rate that the orbital forcing declines. Instead, as the insolation decreases gradually over thousands of years, the landscape holds together, the vegetation sustains itself, the rainfall continues more or less, until the system crosses a threshold. And then, once that threshold is crossed, the feedback takes over, and the transition from green to desert happens rapidly. Not on the time scale of the orbital forcing, not over 10,000 years more deep, but on a much shorter time scale, potentially centuries, as the reinforcing collapse of vegetation and rainfall accelerates itself. This is the mechanism that could explain what is one of the most striking pieces of evidence in the entire story of the Green Sahara. In the sediment cores pulled from the seafloor off the coast of northwest Africa, in particular a site called ODP Site 658C in the Atlantic off Mauritania. The geochemist Peter Domenical and his colleagues found a record of the dust that has blown off the African continent and settled to the ocean floor over thousands of years. Layers of sediment, building up slowly decade by decade and century by century, preserve in their texture and their chemistry a continuous record of how much material was being eroded and blown from the African surface and carried by the wind out to sea. When the Sahara is green, with vegetation holding the soil down and the surface dark and stable, very little dust blows out. When the Sahara is dry and bare, vast quantities of fine particles are lofted into the atmosphere and carried west across the Atlantic, eventually settling through the water column to the seafloor. And in Domenical's cause, that transition from low dust to high dust, from green Sahara to dust Sahara, appears to happen abruptly. The published record from work that Domenical and his colleagues described around the year 2000 suggests that the shift was concentrated around 5,500 years ago, and that it happened not over millennia, but over a period of centuries, perhaps 2 or 3 centuries, perhaps a little more, but fast, on the geological scale that governs everything else in this story. 5,500 years ago. That is not so very long on the timescale we have been moving through. The oldest known writing dates to roughly 5,000 years ago. The pyramids of Giza were built around 4,500 years ago. The transition from a green Sahara to a desert, or at least the concentrated, accelerated phase of that transition, at least in some regions, falls within the same few centuries that see the first cities, the first states, the first complex organized societies in the Nile Valley. The timing is not coincidental, and we will return to it. But first, a note of honesty, because this story has more texture than a single dramatic number implies. The dust core record from the Atlantic, for all its clarity and power, is only one record, taken from one place. And science, when it is working as it should, tests single records against others, looks for where they agree and where they diverge, and tries to build a picture out of the convergence rather than out of any one source alone. One of the most important counterweights to the abrupt termination picture comes from a site in northern Chad called Unianga, where Stefan Krepelin and his colleagues have spent years studying a remarkable thing: a series of lakes in the eastern Sahara that have survived into the present, fed by deep groundwater, surrounded on all sides by desert, preserving in their continuous sediment records a 6,000-year window into how conditions actually changed in the interior of the continent. Lake Yoa, one of the Onianga lakes, has produced a sediment sequence of exceptional resolution, and the story it tells is not quite the same story as the dust cores from the Atlantic. In the Lake Yoa record, published by Krepelin and colleagues in the journal Science in 2008, the transition from humid to arid conditions appears more gradual. Not a sudden cliff edge, but something more like a long slope, with conditions deteriorating over an extended period rather than collapsing at a single threshold. The contrast between this record and Domenical's is not a contradiction so much as a complication. The two records are measuring different things in different places. The dust core in the Atlantic is integrating signals from across a large area of the continent and recording the net effect on the dust output of the whole system. Lake Yoa is a local record from a specific interior basin showing how conditions changed in that particular part of the Sahara. The truth of how the drying happened is probably somewhere in the space between them, some regions crossing thresholds abruptly, while others experienced a more drawn-out, variable decline. The overall collapse a mosaic of local stories that do not all happen at the same time or at the same rate. What does seem robust across all the records is that by roughly 5,000 years ago, and certainly by 4,000 years ago, the world that Kebir represents, the lakes, the cattle, the fishhooks, the triple burial, was gone. The landscape that had supported the Kiffian hunter fishers and the Ternarian pastoralists across a span of more than 5,000 years had dried beyond the point where it could sustain that kind of life. The lake had contracted, the grasses had retreated, and the people had moved. But where? People do not simply vanish when a landscape changes. They are mobile, adaptive, inventive. The pastoralists of the Green Sahara had survived and thrived by following water and grass across enormous distances. When the water retreated, they followed it. The question is, which direction and to what effect? The work of Roland Cooper and Stefan Krupelin, published in Science in 2006, attempted to map the answer by combining archaeological site distributions, where people were living and when, with the paleoclimate record of how the drying progressed. What they found was a pattern of contraction and retreat. During the peak of the African humid period, archaeological sites are distributed broadly across the Sahara, in places that are now entirely uninhabitable. As conditions began to deteriorate, sites cluster progressively southward, following the retreating rainfall into the Sahel and toward the tropical zones where the monsoon still reached. And there is a second concentration, equally important, a movement eastward and northward toward the Nile Valley, where the river provided a permanent, dependable water source even as the surrounding desert dried. The Nile Valley during this period was not an obvious destination. It was bounded on both sides by desert. It was prone to flooding, but it had water, permanent, reliable, annual water delivered by a river whose sources were far to the south in the highland regions of East Africa and Ethiopia, fed by rainfall that the continental drying had not yet eliminated. For people who had spent generations following the monsoon across the open Sahara, the Nile must have appeared as something like a miracle, a river that did not go away, a green corridor in the expanding desert, a place where the kind of life they knew, built around water and cultivation and livestock, might still be possible. The Nile Valley did not receive these migrants passively. It received a demographic and cultural pressure. People with pastoralist knowledge, with domesticated cattle, with agricultural experience accumulated across the humid centuries of the Green Sahara, arriving at a narrow, fertile strip and concentrating there. Researchers like Cooper and Krupelin and others have argued that the Saharan desiccation was not merely a backdrop to the rise of ancient Egypt, but a contributing cause, that the crowding of skilled, organized, technologically capable people into the Nile corridor, driven by the drying of the world they had known, created conditions in which the organization of labor, the management of the river, and the construction of a state were not just possible but necessary. The monuments of ancient Egypt seen from this angle are not quite what they appear. They are, in part, the inheritance of the Green Sahara, built by people whose ancestors had fished in the lakes of the Tenere, herded cattle across the grasslands of the Fezzan, and painted on the walls of the Tassili Naja before the world their culture was shaped in dried away. There is something enormous in that thought, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The triple burial at Kebir, the woman, and the two children, arms extended in the posture of an embrace, was made by a people who lived in the world that the orbital clock had briefly created. The pyramids were built generations later by the inheritors of those people, concentrated by the drying into a river valley, their knowledge and their social complexity refined by pressure into something that could cut stone and move it across distances and align a monument to the stars. The Green Sahara is not just a curiosity of the deep past. It is, in some meaningful sense, part of the story of civilization itself. But it is important not to make this connection into a simple story of cause and effect, as though the drying of the Sahara inevitably and mechanically produced ancient Egypt. The relationship is more tangled than that. There were people in the Nile Valley before the Saharan refugees arrived. There were local developments, local knowledge, local adaptation. The desiccation was a contributing pressure, not a single cause, and the timing of the Saharan drying varied across the continent, so the migration was not a single event, but a process unfolding over centuries, different groups arriving at different times from different directions, carrying different knowledge and different traditions, all of them feeding into the turbulent, generative mixing of cultures that characterized the Nile during the late prehistoric and early historic periods. What we can say is that the world was moving, the landscape that had sustained the Kiffian and the Tenarian, the world that the triple burial comes from, the world that the fishhooks and the harpoons and the great fish bones and the crocodile remains bear witness to, that world was contracting. And the people who had lived in it were contracting with it, following the last water toward the south, toward the Nile, toward the beginning of recorded history. And the mechanism that drove the contraction, the feedback loop, the vegetation-albedo reversal, the way a green landscape can tip over a threshold and become desert faster than the gradual orbital forcing alone would predict, that mechanism was not finished after the Green Sahara ended. It is a property of the system itself. It will operate again in the other direction when the orbital clock turns back and the summer insolation over North Africa rises again and the monsoon begins its long walk north. The same feedback that accelerated the drying may, when conditions are right, accelerate the greening. A landscape at the margin, with a little more rain, begins to support a little more vegetation. The darker vegetated surface absorbs more sunlight. The surface warms differently. The atmosphere responds. More rain falls, more vegetation establishes, the loop runs forward, and the desert becomes, over time, savanna. This symmetry is not perfectly established. The feedbacks may not be perfectly reversible, but it is part of why the transitions in both directions can happen faster than the orbital forcing alone would predict. For the people at Gobero, that feedback operated as loss. The world they had built their lives around was taken from them, not slowly and obviously, but through a process that probably felt, from inside it, like a long run of bad years, a string of droughts, a gradual thinning of the water and the grass, until what had been home was no longer habitable. And then they went wherever they could go, carrying whatever they carried, and the sand came in behind them, and the lake dried, and the diatomite, the fossil algae sediment that once formed on the lake bed, was buried under dunes, and the cemetery was buried, and everything was buried, and the Tenere became what it is today, except that it was not entirely buried. The bones remained, the harpoons remained, the triple burial remained beneath the surface, intact, waiting for the moment when the wind shifted the sand away and the morning light fell on the bones of the woman and the two children again, and someone with the knowledge to understand what they were looking at came across them in that vast, silent, empty landscape. And now we know that Gobero was there, and that the people were there, and that the world was different, and that the same forces that made it different will, in their own deep time, make it different again. That is the thought the dust record and the lake record and the abrupt drying debate all converge on from different directions and at different levels of resolution. The system is not random, it is not governed by chaos, it is governed by the same orbital mechanics that put the summer sun above North Africa 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, and then slowly, inexorably withdrew it. Those mechanics have not stopped. The Earth's axis is still wobbling. the orbit is still doing what orbits do. The precession cycle, that slow rotation of the equinoxes around the circuit of the year, is still turning. The question is not whether the conditions will be favorable again. On the time scale of the precession cycle, they will be. The question is when and how we understand what that means. The drying that ended the Green Sahara concentrated its human populations and contributed, in the complex and multi-causal way that history always works, to one of the most consequential chapters in the human story. The civilization that grew in the Nile Valley, the monuments and the writing and the organized society that followed from the confluence of all those pressures, is still with us in its inheritance. The Sahara that replaced the green world is still with us as well, still blowing, still vast, still one of the largest deserts on Earth, its sand still carrying across the Atlantic on the trade winds to fall eventually into the forests of South America, feeding the Amazon with phosphorus the desert has been accumulating for thousands of years. The story of the drying is not a story of simple loss. It is a story of transformation of the same substance, the same land, moving through different states, each state generating its own consequences, its own ecologies, its own human histories. The Green Sahara generated the lives of the Kiffian and the Tenerian, the paintings on the walls of the Tassili Niger, the swimmers in the Gilf Kebir, and the demographic pressure that helped shape ancient Egypt. The dry Sahara generates the dust that crosses the ocean and maintains the fertility of the Amazon. Nothing is simply waste. Everything is part of the cycle, serving the next state of the system from within the current one. And underneath the sand, the cycle has left other records. The vegetation-albedo feedback, the abrupt termination debated between Domenical's dust cores and Kröppelin's lake sediments, the human movement tracked by Cooper and Kröppelin. These are the most immediate and most human-scale consequences of the drying. But the same event is written in other archives at other depths in other media, each one adding another layer to the understanding of a system that has been cycling through green and dry for as long as North Africa has existed in its current configuration, and long before any human eye was there to observe it. Somewhere in the deep sediments of the Atlantic seafloor, far offshore from the continent, the record of every past Green Sahara is preserved in the chemistry and texture of the mud. When the Sahara is green, the dust flux from Africa to the ocean drops. When the Sahara is dry, the dust flux rises. This signal is clear and it repeats over and over at intervals that correspond to the precession cycle. Not just the last Green Sahara, not just the one before it. Dozens of cycles, each one leaving its mark in the sediment column, building up over hundreds of thousands of years, creating a physical record of the Earth's behavior that reaches back long before our species existed. The Tenerian pastoralists at Gobero, the ones who made the triple burial, were the last human inhabitants of that Green Sahara. They were living in the final chapter of an African humid period that had itself been preceded by many others, each one governed by the same physics, each one playing out with the same broad logic. The insolation rises, the monsoon walks north, the lakes fill, the vegetation establishes, the feedback runs forward, the green world peaks, the insolation falls. The feedback reverses, the desert returns. Over and over, a breathing, cycling, patient system, indifferent to any particular population of organisms that happens to live within it, including ours. The people at Gobero were not the first people to live in a Green Sahara. Precession had turned in their favor before, and before that, and before that again, each time over the last several 100,000 years, creating the conditions for human occupation, and each time ending and forcing whatever population had established itself to adapt or move. Our species has been chasing the African humid period across the continent for as long as we have existed as a species. The Green Sahara is not an anomaly in our history, it is a recurring feature of it. And that deep history and the many cycles written in the sediment, the recurring fingerprints of past green Saharas in the mud of the seafloor, is where the story opens out from the human to something larger and slower, and in its own way, even more extraordinary. Because the evidence for all of this is not just in the bones at Gobero or the paintings on the walls of the Tassili Naja. It is in the seafloor itself, in the chemistry of ancient mud, in the buried river channels visible only to satellites with radar eyes, in the water under the desert that fell as rain thousands of years ago and has been sitting there in the dark ever since, waiting. The Green Sahara left its record everywhere, and reading those records, understanding what they mean and how they fit together and what they tell us about both the past and the future, is the work of hundreds of researchers across dozens of disciplines, each one adding a piece to a picture that is still being assembled. But the outline of the picture is already clear. The Sahara breathes. It has breathed for longer than we can easily imagine. The woman at Gobero and her 2 children were buried during one of those breaths, in a green world that the orbital clock had briefly created by people who had no way of knowing that the world they knew was already, by increments too small to perceive, beginning to end. And the desert that came after them is not the final state of North Africa any more than the green world was. It is a phase, a long phase by human reckoning, but a phase. The next inhale is already scheduled. It is written in the geometry of the orbit, in the numbers of the precession cycle, as certainly as anything in planetary science. The question of when is a question with an answer. Not a comfortable, near-term answer, but a real one, and a stranger and more wonderful one for being so far away. And that answer, the honest accounting of when the Sahara will breathe green again, and what it means that we can calculate it from where we stand, is where this story is heading next. But for now, let the Ténéré be what it is. Let the sand lie over the bones of Gobero, over the harpoons and the fish hooks and the remnants of the great fish and the crocodiles, over the triple burial with its arms extended in grief and tenderness across 7,000 years of time. Let the Tassili Naja stand in the Algerian highlands with its 15,000 engravings and paintings, its giraffes and its cattle and its swimmers, its record of a world that was real and full and alive and then ended. Let the orbital clock turn as it always has. Everything that was lost to the drying is still there, somewhere in the system, in the sediments, in the aquifers, in the dust crossing the Atlantic, in the records written in stone and mud and chemistry that the researchers are still reading, page by page. The Green Sahara did not disappear. It changed state, and the forces that changed it are still running, still patient, still indifferent, and still, in their own immense and geologically measured way, reliable. The cycle continues. And so we come to the oldest question the record can answer. Not how long ago the Green Sahara was, not what it looked like, or who lived inside it, or how it died. Those questions have their answers laid out across the highlands and the sediments and the buried graveyards of the deep desert. The oldest question is a different one, and it is this: how far back does the pattern go? Because if the African humid period were a single event, a freak alignment, a one-time accident of planetary circumstance, then its loss would be simply a loss, and its future return, if it came at all, would be impossible to predict with any confidence. You cannot forecast the next occurrence of something that has happened only once. You can only mourn it. But if the pattern goes back, and if it repeats again and again across hundreds of thousands of years, paced by the same slow mechanism, then what we are looking at is not a relic, it is a rhythm. And rhythms have a next beat. The record goes back very far indeed. Geologists and paleoclimatologists have been assembling this record for decades, drawing it out of places that seem at first completely unrelated to the Sahara itself. Not from the desert surface where wind and erosion tend to scramble and bury the evidence. Not from the rock art sites, which speak to human timescales rather than geological ones. The deepest record of the Sahara's green and dry alternation comes from places where sediment accumulates slowly, undisturbed, layer upon layer, in calm water, and where each layer is a year, or a decade, or a century, sealed and preserved like a sentence in a very old book that nobody has finished reading. Some of those layers are on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of northwestern Africa. When the Sahara is dry, the wind picks up enormous quantities of fine dust and carries it westward over the ocean, where it eventually settles to the seafloor. Marine sediment cores drilled from that seafloor show thin and thick layers of this terrigenous dust of continental origin, sand and clay particles blown off the desert, alternating with layers that are comparatively clean, low in dust, made mostly of marine particles. The clean layers are the wet phases, the dusty layers are the dry ones, and when you count them back through time, you find not one wet-dry alternation, but many, dozens. A steady oscillation going back through the Pleistocene and beyond, across hundreds of thousands of years, each cycle separated from the next by roughly 20,000 years, the familiar precession period, give or take the modulations imposed by the longer cycles. The other deep archive is not in the Atlantic at all, it is in the Mediterranean Sea, and what it records is not the desert's dust going out, but the desert's water coming in. When the Sahara is green, when the monsoon reaches far north and rain falls on the highlands of Algeria and Libya and Chad and Sudan, the rivers draining that vast interior carry enormous volumes of fresh water northward. The Nile, which drains much of northeastern Africa, would have run in full flood year after year, carrying not just water, but dissolved nutrients, the chemistry of a living, vegetated landscape, into the Mediterranean basin. Other drainage systems, now dry, would have contributed their own flows, and when that surge of fresh water reached the eastern Mediterranean, it did something peculiar to the sea. Fresh water is lighter than salt water. A massive influx of riverine fresh water would have floated on top of the denser, saltier Mediterranean water below, creating a stable layer that suppressed the normal mixing of the water column. The deep water, cut off from the surface, would have become progressively oxygen-starved, and the organisms that died and sank to that oxygen-depleted bottom would have been preserved rather than decomposed, layer after layer of organic rich sediment accumulating in the stillness, dark and dense, a geological record of biological abundance above and oxygen absence below. These layers are called sapropels. The word comes from Greek roots meaning rotten mud, and they appear on the floor of the Mediterranean in a sequence that mirrors, almost exactly, the dust record from the Atlantic, offset by a few hundred years to account for the lag between insolation change and the response of the river systems. Each sapropel is a green Sahara made permanent in the chemistry of the seafloor. Each sapropel is a Nile in full organic flood. They were first systematically analyzed and their connection to orbital forcing established by Rossignol-Strick in the mid-1980s, and they have since become one of the most important independent confirmations that the African humid period is not a quirk but a cycle. The same 21,000-year precession beat, written in a completely different medium on the floor of a completely different sea, thousands of kilometers from the desert itself. The sapropels count back through time. S1, the most recent, deposited during the last African humid period, S3, the one before, S5 going back roughly 100,000 years to the last major interglacial, when the greening was probably even more intense than the one Gobero and the cave of swimmers inhabited. And beyond S5, older sapropels still, going back further than the anatomically modern humans who painted the rock art could have imagined. Each layer a breath. Each breath 20,000 years apart, give or take. The Mediterranean floor is a library of the Sahara's heartbeat, written in organic mud. And the signal is not perfectly regular. It is not a metronome. The longer cycles of the Milankovitch ensemble modulate it as they modulate everything. Eccentricity, the roughly 100,000-year variation in how elliptical Earth's orbit is, controls how strongly the precession wobble matters. When eccentricity is high, Earth's distance from the Sun varies significantly through the year, and the effect of perihelion coinciding with northern summer is amplified. The same precession alignment that produces only a modest insolation enhancement during a low eccentricity period can produce a dramatically stronger one when eccentricity is high. So the green Saharas of the deep past were not all equally green. Some were more intense, more extensive, more fully inhabited. Some were weaker, partial, confined to narrower latitudinal bands. The obliquity cycle, the roughly 41,000-year variation in the tilt of Earth's axis, adds another modulation, affecting the overall difference between seasons globally and interacting with precession in complex ways that climate modelers are still working to fully characterize. The result is not a simple sine wave, but something more like a complex musical phrase, a melody with harmonics where the main theme recurs every 20,000 years, but is colored differently each time by the longer accompaniment of the eccentricity and obliquity variations. And within that long musical phrase, the last African humid period, the one that ended 5,000 years ago, the one that gave us Gobero and the cave of swimmers and the 15,000 images on the walls of the Tassili Naja, was one verse. A particularly rich verse, as it happened, occurring during a phase of moderate eccentricity, not the most extreme greening the Sahara has ever experienced, but extensive enough to support a fully inhabited landscape across much of what is now hyper-arid desert. You can think of the record this way. Imagine a clock, not an ordinary clock with a 12-hour face, but a vast, deep time clock with a face covering hundreds of thousands of years. The hands that matter are not seconds and minutes, but the slow rotations of Earth's axial wobble and the even slower variations in the shape of the orbit. And on that clock, the last green Sahara was a certain hour. Let us say it was just after 3 in the afternoon of a long geological day, and the sapropels on the Mediterranean floor, and the dust flux records in the Atlantic, and the pollen in the lake sediments, and the bones at Gobero, all together tell us exactly when that hour was and how long it lasted. They also tell us, by extension, where the hands are now and where they are pointing next. The hands are pointing away from green for a very long time. But let us stay with the record before we come to the forecast, because the full depth of the archive contains more than the rhythm. It contains the ghosts that the cycle leaves behind, the physical evidence that the green Sahara was not simply a climate condition that passed without a trace, but a state of the Earth system that altered things permanently in ways that are still reverberating through the present. The first ghost is underground, beneath the surface of the Sahara, beneath the sand and the rock and the layers of Aeolian sediment that the desert has deposited over millennia. There is water. An enormous amount of water held in porous sandstone formations that extend across parts of Egypt, Libya, Sudan, and Chad. The largest of these is called the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer System, one of the largest known fossil groundwater systems in the world, holding perhaps 150,000 cubic kilometers of water, a volume almost beyond intuitive grasp, roughly equivalent to a very significant fraction of all the water in the world's freshwater lakes. And this water did not fall there recently. Isotopic analysis of the water, looking at the ratios of different forms, different isotopes of oxygen and hydrogen in the molecules, shows ages on the order of tens of thousands of years for much of it. This is water that fell as rain during the last African humid period, or during even earlier humid phases, percolated down through the surface, moved slowly through the porous sandstone, and has been sitting there in the dark ever since. It is, in a very literal sense, the rain of the Green Sahara stored underground, waiting. There is a quality to this fact that is difficult to hold in the mind all at once. You are standing in one of the driest places on the planet's surface. The sand around you has not seen significant rainfall in thousands of years. The last time rain fell here in any sustained and meaningful way, the pastoral people were herding cattle across the plains above the very aquifer that lies under your feet. And a few hundred meters below the sand, those rains are still here. The Green Sahara is still here, in the dark, in the chemistry of the water, patient and ancient and real. The desert is only the surface. Underneath, something much older is still holding on. The second ghost is visible from space. Radar instruments aboard the space shuttle and subsequently aboard orbital satellites have the ability to penetrate through dry sand, not deeply, only a few meters, but far enough to image features on the underlying surface that the sand has buried. And when those radar images were processed and analyzed, they revealed something remarkable beneath the sands of the Eastern Sahara. The outlines of ancient river channels, not small seasonal streams but large drainage systems, broad valleys and branching tributaries that had clearly carried enormous volumes of water, carving into the rock beneath the sand before being buried under the accumulating desert. Rivers that no longer exist. Rivers that have not carried water for thousands of years, perhaps longer. Ghost rivers, the plumbing of the Green Sahara, visible only because radar can see through what the eye cannot. The Taman Reset River system and the Kufra drainage network are among the most discussed of these buried systems, stretching hundreds of kilometers across what are now the most inhospitable parts of the desert. Work published in 2015 by researchers including Skonieczny and colleagues traced one such buried paleo river system all the way to the Atlantic coast, where it met a submarine canyon on the seafloor, an ancient river mouth, now under the ocean, leading back into the Sahara's buried interior. The river is gone. The canyon where it met the sea is still there, carved into the continental shelf, a geological scar left by water that has not flowed for a very long time. You can trace the full length of it on a map, from the deep interior of the desert, where the radar shows the buried channels, out to the coast, where the seafloor shows the ancient estuary. An entire river, from source to sea, invisible on the surface and visible only in the instruments of orbital science. These buried rivers are the structural skeleton of the Green Sahara's hydrology. They are what happened to the rain after it fell, the pathways it followed downhill to the sea, through the lakes and the wetlands and the floodplains of a landscape that is now sand. They tell us not just that there was water, but how much and in what directions it moved, and what kind of watershed structure the living Sahara had. They are evidence as solid as the rock art, as specific as the stratigraphy at Gobero, and they are written in the shape of the land itself, waiting under the sand for an instrument sensitive enough to read them. The third ghost travels across an ocean. The Sahara is the world's largest hot desert, and it generates an enormous quantity of airborne dust, fine mineral particles lifted by the wind from the dry surface and carried in vast plumes, sometimes visible from satellite photographs, as orange-brown clouds drifting westward across the Atlantic. The dust is a nuisance, and it is also a fertilizer. The mineral particles carried in Saharan dust are rich in phosphorus, an element that is often the limiting nutrient in tropical ecosystems, the nutrient that, when present, allows plants and algae to grow, and when absent, holds them back. And when Saharan dust falls into the Amazon basin in South America, it delivers that phosphorus to one of the most biologically productive ecosystems on Earth. Researchers using data from instruments including the Calypso satellite, which tracks aerosols in the atmosphere from orbit, and ground measurements of dust deposition in the Amazon have traced this connection in detail. Estimates suggest that tens of millions of tons of Saharan dust cross the Atlantic each year, and that a significant portion of the phosphorus that sustains the Amazon rainforest's extraordinary productivity arrives via this aerial pathway. The Amazon and the Sahara are, in a sense, connected, the death of one feeding the life of the other, across 5,000 kilometers of open ocean through the medium of wind-borne mineral dust. This is the kind of connection that is easy to state and hard to fully take in. The Sahara, which we think of as a place where nothing lives and nothing grows, is actively maintaining the fertility of one of the greatest concentrations of life on the planet. Not through water, not through proximity, but through the slow, patient work of wind carrying minerals from a dead landscape to a living one. The dry desert feeds the wet rainforest. The barren place sustains the abundant one, and this transfer has varied enormously over the geological past. During a green Sahara, when the surface was covered in vegetation, the amount of dust lifted and carried across the Atlantic would have been dramatically reduced because living plants anchor the soil and suppress the dust. A green Sahara would mean a less well-fertilized Amazon in some complex way that researchers are still working to quantify. And a future greening of the Sahara would mean, among many other things, a change in the amount of mineral nutrient reaching the other side of the Atlantic. The systems are interlocked in ways that cross entire ocean basins. All of these ghosts, the fossil water under the desert, the buried rivers beneath the sand, the dust crossing the Atlantic to feed the Amazon, are the Sahara's signature on the present world, the living evidence that the green phase was real and consequential, that it altered the planet's plumbing in ways that persist long after the vegetation is gone. The green Sahara has been over for 5,000 years, and it is still shaping the Amazon's fertility. It is still holding its rain underground in the Nubian aquifer. Its old river channels are still carved into the bedrock below the sand. The past is not absent. It has simply changed form. And now the forecast. It is the question the title promises, and it is a question that deserves a real answer rather than a vague gesture towards some future that might or might not arrive. The answer is this: the greening will come. It is not in question. The orbital mechanics that produced every past African humid period, every past sap propel on the Mediterranean floor, every past episode of Saharan lakes and swimming humans and herded cattle, those mechanics are still running. They have never stopped. Precession is still turning. The perihelion point is still drifting slowly around the orbit, and in tens of thousands of years, it will return to coincide with Northern Hemisphere summer. Summer insolation over North Africa will rise again. The monsoon will walk north again. The desert will inhale. But the timing is not soon. This is the part of the honest answer that is easy to soften or to obscure because the ear wants to hear something nearer. The next clear orbital window for a significant African humid period type greening. The next time the precession alignment is favorable in the way it was 11,000 years ago is commonly placed on the order of 15,000 to 20,000 years in the future at the earliest. Some modeling studies place the next strong favorable alignment beyond that. The numbers vary depending on how you define the threshold, what combination of orbital parameters you require, and how you account for the modulating effects of eccentricity and obliquity. But the robust answer, the one that holds across different methods and different thresholds, is that we are nowhere near the next peak. The orbital clock has just passed through a green Sahara hour. It is now swinging away from it, deep into the dry phase. The next green hour is a very long way around the dial, 15,000 years, 20,000 years. These are numbers that sit oddly in the mind. A human life is perhaps 80 years. A civilization in the broad sense has existed for perhaps 10,000 years. The Green Sahara died 5,000 years ago, before the Egyptian Old Kingdom, before the construction of Khufu's pyramid, before writing had fully developed in the Nile Valley. And the next greening is further away from us than that death is. We are closer in time to the swimmers in the Gilf Kebir than we are to the people who will walk into the next green Sahara, if any walk there at all. There is a particular quality to this kind of deep time perspective that is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. We are accustomed in ordinary life to thinking in timescales of years and decades, occasionally of centuries. The political and historical imagination extends with effort to 1,000 years, to the medieval, to the ancient. The natural sciences require us to stretch much further into timescales that have no good intuitive analogue in human experience. 15,000 years is not a long time in geological terms. In geological terms, it is the blink of an eye, the brief interval since the last glacial maximum, since the ice sheets that covered much of North America and Northern Europe were still present, since the sea level was more than 100 meters lower than it is now. But in human terms, 15,000 years is so long that it is essentially a different world, a world whose human inhabitants are as remote from us as we are from them, connected only by the continuity of biology and the persistence of the orbital clock that governs both. What this means is not despair. It is something stranger and more interesting than despair. It means that the Green Sahara belongs to deep time, and that deep time is not separate from us. It is the context in which we exist, whether or not we are aware of it. The orbital clock that schedules the next greening is the same clock that scheduled the last one. The precession cycle that will one day drag the monsoon north again is the same cycle that dragged it north 11,000 years ago when the Kiphian people were fishing from the shores of Gobero, when Laszlo Almasi had not yet been born, when Egypt had not yet built anything. The calendar is continuous. We simply happen to be reading it at a particular moment, a dry moment, and the next wet entry is a long way down the page. And there is a genuine, if quiet, comfort in this. Not the comfort of expecting to see the greening. None of us will, and no one living today will, and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, to a depth that defies genealogical imagination, will not either. But the comfort of knowing that the pattern is real, that it is not a coincidence, that the evidence of it is written in the Atlantic seafloor, and in the Mediterranean mud, and in the paleo shorelines of Lake Megachad, and in the bones of the people of Gobero, and in the paintings on the Tassili Naja, and in the fossil water under the Nubian sandstone, and in the ghost rivers beneath the sand, and in the dust currently crossing the Atlantic to feed the Amazon. The Green Sahara is not a legend or a speculation. It is a fact of the planetary system as documented and as certain as the structure of the atmosphere or the temperature of the deep ocean. And facts of that kind, facts written into the physics of the orbit and the chemistry of the Earth system, do not forget to recur simply because the timescales involved exceed the duration of human civilization. The Sahara is breathing, very slowly, on a rhythm measured in tens of thousands of years, but breathing nonetheless. The exhale has been going on for 5,000 years, and it will continue for a very long time. The inhale will come. The monsoon will walk north. The dust will settle. The rains will return to the high plateaus of Algeria and Libya and Niger and Chad. The rivers will flow again through channels that are currently buried under sand. The aquifer, if it has not been drawn down to nothing in the interval, will be replenished. The lakes will fill. The fish and the crocodiles will follow the water as it moves north. The grass will come first, then the shrubs, then the trees along the river corridors, and gradually, over centuries and millennia, the landscape that was once alive will live again. The rock art will still be there on the walls of the Tassili Naja, waiting alongside whatever new marks some future people might make on the stone of a landscape they have never known as desert. It is an extraordinary fact of this moment in history that we can know this, that we can stand in the present on the floor of a desert that feels as permanent as anything on the surface of the earth, and read the record of its past and calculate the timing of its future. The tools that allow this, the ocean sediment cores, the radar satellites, the isotope laboratories, the orbital calculations that go back and forward millions of years with mathematical precision, are the products of the last century of science, built on the foundational work of Milankovitch in the early 20th century and elaborated by generations of researchers since. Kutzbach's modelling of the monsoon response to insolation, Domenical's reading of the dust record, Rossignol-Strick's identification of the sapropels as orbital fingerprints, Sereno's excavation of Gobero, Kröpelin's long patient work at Lake Yoa, threading the gradual record of the drying against the abruptness implied by the Atlantic dust cores, Clausen's modelling of the vegetation-albedo feedback, Skonieczny's tracing of the buried rivers to the sea. All of these, separately, built a piece of the picture. Together, they have made it possible to know something that no previous generation of human beings could have known, that the desert breathes, and roughly when it will next breathe in. The Green Sahara was not a paradise lost. It was not an Eden, and it was not a jungle, and it was not a unique and unrepeatable accident of geological circumstance. It was a phase in a cycle inhabited by people who had no reason to know they were living in a phase, who built their lives around the lakes and the rivers and the cattle and the fish, and who left their record on the stone because they were present and because they mattered, as all people in all places at all times matter, regardless of whether the orbital clock is pointed toward abundance or toward sand. And the desert that came after them was not a punishment or an ending. It was the same cycle, exhaling, the same physics that brought the rain took it away. The same precession that aimed the summer sun at North Africa turned it away again, gradually. And then the vegetation-albedo feedback caught the threshold, and the door closed quickly or perhaps gradually, depending on where you were standing and what the local landscape looked like and how close to the edge the ecological system already was when the orbital nudge arrived. Either way, the outcome was the same. The green gave way to the brown to the yellow to the white. The lakes contracted, the rivers stopped. The people followed the rains south and east toward the Nile, toward the places where water was still reliable. They carried with them whatever they had learned about cattle, about fishing, about living in a landscape that was generous. They folded those skills and that knowledge into whatever came next. The rock art stayed, the bones stayed, the water stayed underground, the rivers stayed, fossilized in the radar return from space, and the dust went on crossing the ocean. All of this is still here. Nothing has been truly lost. It has changed form as the Sahara itself changes form, as everything in the Earth system changes form on the long time scales where the orbital clock keeps time. The Green Sahara is currently a desert, and currently an aquifer, and currently a dust plume above the Atlantic, and currently a record written in the sediment of the Mediterranean floor, and currently a set of paintings on a limestone wall in Algeria that a handful of researchers visit each year in the thin November light. It is all of these things simultaneously, and in tens of thousands of years It will be a savanna again, a wetland again, a place where some form of life gathers around the edges of filling lakes and leaves its marks on the stone. The cycle continues. It has always continued. It will continue long after everything we have built and named and measured is itself a layer in a sediment record, long after the languages in which these facts are described have changed beyond recognition, long after the instruments that read the orbital forcing equations have been replaced by instruments we cannot imagine. The precession cycle does not require our attention. It does not slow down when we forget about it and speed up when we remember. It turns at its own pace, as it has turned since the Earth first had an axis, and it will turn at that pace as long as the Earth and the Sun remain in something like their current relationship. What changes is only our ability to know what the turning means, and that is not a small thing. The Kiffian people who fished the shores of ancient Gobero 9,000 years ago could not have known that the rains would end, that the lake would shrink, that the land they lived on was a transient green window in a long dry cycle governed by the geometry of the orbit. They lived in it without knowing its edges. We live in the dry phase, knowing both its edges and its eventual successor. That knowledge does not change the timeline, but it changes something about how the desert feels to stand inside of. It is not a permanent condition. It is not a verdict. It is a phase, and somewhere, deep in the sand, the rain of the green Sahara is still waiting underground, in the dark, in the porous sandstone of the Nubian aquifer, patient and cold and ancient and real. The desert is quiet tonight, wherever you are listening from. If you are somewhere that can hear the wind, it is perhaps carrying a little dust, Saharan or otherwise, some fine particulate of the world's dry places, drifting on the currents that cross oceans and continents with perfect indifference to borders and timescales. If you are somewhere still and enclosed with the sounds of a night settling into silence around you, then the quiet you are hearing is on a different scale than it might seem. Not just the quiet of an hour or an evening, but, in some faint way, the quiet of the long exhale, the ongoing dryness of the desert's current phase, 5,000 years into the outbreath, and many thousands more years yet to run before the geometry shifts and the monsoon begins its slow walk north again. Tell me if you feel inclined where in the world you are listening from tonight. What is outside your window? Whether the night where you are is warm or cold, still or restless, whether the sky is clear or covered. I would genuinely like to know. The comments are there, and I read them. You have come a long way through this story tonight. From the shrunken shore of Lake Chad to the 350,000 square kilometer surface of the lake it once was. From the bones of the great fish at Gobero to the woman and the two children buried with their arms reaching for each other across 7,000 years. From the walls of the Tassili Naja covered in painted giraffes and swimming figures to the Atlantic sea floor where the Sahara's old rivers meet the ocean in a canyon carved by water that no longer flows. From the fast door of the vegetation-albedo feedback to the patient slow turning of the precession clock, which scheduled the last greening and will schedule the next, reliably and without haste, in approximately 15,000 to 20,000 years. It is a long time. It is also a certainty. Both things are true together, and there is something restful, perhaps, in their combination, in the knowledge that the largest things move at their own pace and do not require anything from us beyond the occasional act of looking and understanding. If you are new here, and this kind of slow journey, deep time and deep quiet, the long geological view, taken one patient breath at a time, is what you were looking for. There are more stories here of the same careful kind. They will be here whenever you want them. For now, let the orbital clock turn, let the precession drift. Let the dust go on crossing the Atlantic in its slow phosphorescent arc, feeding a rainforest on another continent with the minerals of a dead desert. Let the fossil water sit in the dark under the Nubian sandstone, ancient and quiet and undisturbed. Let the buried rivers stay buried, threaded beneath the sand in channels that no water has touched for millennia, pointing toward a coast they no longer reach. Let the sapropels lie on the Mediterranean floor, each one a green Sahara in compressed organic memory, ticking on the 21,000-year beat of a clock that no one needed to wind. You have done enough for one night. Put down whatever remains of the day. The sand is still. The orbit turns. The monsoon is patient. Lecture's over. Even the professor sleeps. Good night.